Okay, thank you. I'll assume you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Good. Firstly, I acknowledge that I live, work, mother, and speak to you today on the unceded lands of the Kaurna and Paramount people in the Adelaide Hills, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. This paper reports on and extends findings from my recent studio-led PhD project called Making the New Normal, representing mothers' subjectivities and their creative potential against persistent patriarchal models. The interruptions of COVID-19 led to an exploration of the ways the pandemic impacted women's and mothers' work, care, and art-making practices within public and private space. Research shows that while life under COVID-19 was often construed as a new normal, there is little new about the gendered division of labour that marks mothering experiences in COVID lockdowns. Instead, I argue that adaptations in the ways we work, teach and learn and make art from home may further deepen the problems of the ideologies of neoliberalism, where care and domestic work are individualised as feminised responsibilities. Can we instead privilege the domestic sphere as a generative space of creative potential? In March 2020, when the widespread impacts from COVID-19 began to be felt in Australia, I was teaching in and head of the Art History and Theory Department at the Adelaide Central School of Art, ACSA. I had a child in high school and a child in primary school. I was also partway through my PhD project. Grounded in matricentric feminism, this research investigates ways we practice care and value work in the locus of the domestic when labouring under the pressures of colliding shifts. Can we value homework without compromising or romanticising the sanctuary of the home? Western neoliberal individualised models of motherhood still often privilege the idea of intensive mothering. The term intensive mothering was coined by sociologist Sharon Hayes and is construed as child-centred, expert-guided, emotionally absorbing, labour-intensive and financially expensive. According to academic and author D. Lynn O'Brien Halstein, the three central concepts of this model are that it is a mother's duty to be the primary carer for the child. This care requires constant attention and energy and is separated from professional paid work. Together, these tenets of intensive mothering make it harder for mothers to undertake work outside of the family unit, whilst devaluing maternal care that is positioned as natural. This model also relegates care to the private, devalued domestic space of the home. Evidence continues to show that despite mothers' increasing involvement in the workforce, in fact, most mothers participate in work outside of the home, they also continue to do the majority of domestic labour. Studies leading up to 2020 consistently show that there has been only a slight increase in the amount of domestic work undertaken by men in heterosexual couples over the last few decades, but that women continue to be responsible for the majority of unpaid domestic labour and childcare. In Modern Motherhood and Women's Dual Identities, Rewriting the Sexual Contract, Petra Bueskens writes that many women are disappointed to find their domestic roles and relationships revert to patriarchal gender norms with the births of their children. In 2020, there was a proliferation of texts from newspaper articles and academic journals to radio broadcasts and social media posts that provided evidence that traditional gendered care roles remain in place within Western neoliberal heterosexual partnered families and shaped women's COVID-19 experiences. Mainstream media continues to represent and perpetuate constructs of intensive motherhood. In their study of food advertising, Jinhee Lee, Ji-Mi Hong, and Hyuk Jun Chong find that advertising often uses the motherhood tropes of the mother as multitasker, both nurturer and worker. Hence, the mother is presented as a super mom. This depiction of the mother who effortlessly straddles professional and domestic realms, her individual and maternal selves, represents a problem that Bueskens defines as a central dilemma in late modernity. Researcher Irem Gini-Fram writes that because neoliberalism relies on individualization, The responsibility to manage one's daily life and to make the right choices is largely left to each individual. Thus, mothers must labour in a self-sufficiency model of care without taking into account the structural issues that result in their individual problems. What became apparent for me during my research is that while we were repeatedly told that life under COVID-19 was unprecedented, there is little new about the gendered division of labour that marks mothering experiences in COVID lockdowns. Flexible home-based work arrangements that have developed throughout this period, as mothers have struggled to cope with demands of work and family, are now being celebrated as new ways women can have it all. But according to Kadoglu Triantafillia and Katerina Sari, there appears to be an assumption that during periods of economic crisis, women should be encouraged to return home to do what they know how to do best, bear and raise children. In many cases now, there is also the expectation that professional work will continue at home along with traditional home-based roles. I argue that COVID adaptations have continued to further fragment mothers and domestic care workers. Even before COVID-19, working at home was associated with higher subjective time stress and did not facilitate better work-life balance in the sense of increasing time in leisure and personal activities. Lynn Craig and Brendan Churchill find that working from home involves more multitasking, with many women blurring the boundaries between employment and family demands by performing paid work whilst supervising children at the same time. While switching the brain from one mode to another has been found to be physically tiring, having to think and do everything at once in the same temporal and spatial location is mentally exhausting. During lockdowns, there were instances when mothers' professional lives collided with their mothering roles live on television, demonstrating the pressures of fulfilling many roles within the same location, the home. In one case, Dr. Claire Wenham, Assistant Professor of Global Health Policy at the London School of Economics, was interrupted by her daughter holding a drawing of a unicorn and asking the BBC interviewer's name. Wenham continued talking as she responded to her daughter and lifted her off the desk and out of view of the computer's camera, showing what the Guardian newspaper calls heroic levels of patience and professionalism. In another interview on Sky News, UK Foreign Affairs editor Deborah Haynes was interrupted by her son bursting in to ask for biscuits. In both these instances, the mothers, each professionals in their fields, working from home during lockdown, were interrupted by their young children who failed to respect the arbitrary boundaries between work and mother space. Mother space has been defined by Marsha Marotta as being space in which mothering occurs, made up of the complex relationships between bodies, space, and things. Marotta also makes clear that mothering does not only occur in private in the home, and that mother space extends to anywhere that mothering occurs, including public spaces like playgrounds and shopping centres, and during COVID, live on TV. Mothers and their mothering practices are surveilled by others who intersect with their mother space, so they may feel compelled to perform intensive mothering. Artist Mary Lunig makes public a version of perhaps dysfunctional mothering with shocking effect in many of her drawings. Lunig's work challenges the expectations of models of ideal motherhood and undermines the sentimentalised notion of home sweet home. COVID-19 restrictions made clear that in many families, it's still expected that women will make their jobs fit around childcare and homeschooling. Helen Lewis in The Coronavirus is a Disaster for Feminism argues that there is a widespread assumption that childcare work is soaked up by private citizens. This fails to acknowledge the intensity of care work, especially when paid work and care must be undertaken in the same time and place. These photos are visual records of the intensity of this experience in our home. My small open plan home became art studio, research office, work office, school classroom and leisure space for almost 2 months, which was a much shorter period than for others elsewhere in Australia and globally. While my sons were old enough not to ask for biscuits during online Zoom tutorials, I still worked with pets and family members traipsing in and out of the frame until I uploaded a photo of Marie Antoinette's bedroom as my wallpaper. This felt like a kind of betrayal to Leunig, who depicts the real chaos and precarity of mothering. However, this ploy enabled me to separate, albeit virtually, one shift from another. In this way, I recorded lectures in my bedroom, had Zoom meetings on the floor with the laptop propped on the coffee table. I turned the video off as I prepared food and attended meetings. At the same time, I tried to ensure my sons did not become completely disengaged from their learning, as their teachers tried to juggle their own kids, pets, and home duties. Not fooled by the appearance of tropical islands and forests behind the heads of my art history and theory students on our weekly Zoom tutorial sessions, I reflected on my own sense of isolation and being overwhelmed when considering how remote learning may impact my students. As Nerina Dunt writes in Network Recovery, Maximising the Educational Experience After Crisis Mode, ACSA implemented online learning from 20th of April to 26th of June 2020. This was a wholly new experience for the private tertiary art school, whose pedagogical approach is based on the face-to-face teaching of the Atelier model. Dunt observes that in this necessary move to online learning, students may have been at risk of hyper-individualism. Recognising that intensive mothering models are also based on individualisation, a failure to acknowledge structural problems that isolate mothers and carers, I was acutely aware that students required particular supports to ensure their ongoing engagement in learning. An Evidence for Learning Insights paper investigates COVID impacts on Australian school learning outcomes. It finds that schools seeking to assess rates of student disengagement were less focused on using indicators related to academic progress and educational aspirations during the learning at home phase of COVID, prioritising indicators related to immediate issues such as communication, access, and well-being. ACSA management and staff also focused on student well-being at this time. Dunt reports how inbuilt interactivity on the online platform was important in contributing to students feeling connected to one another and built well-being and resilience amongst classmates. Working and/or studying from home may have exacerbated the experience of home as an ambivalent site for many parents and carers, as the multiple shifts of work and care all converge in the home, a site that researchers Fiona Jenkins and Julie Smith argue policymakers, employers took for granted as a background support of economic life. For mothers who are artists, the home has long been recognised as a contested space. Maria Walsh writes that artist Louise Bourgeois returned again and again to the theme of the house as the progenitor of fear and anxiety, using the trope of Freud's familiar unfamiliar mapped onto the female body and the house. Bourgeois repeatedly represents the home as both a sanctuary and a site of women's oppression. For mothers who are also artists, the idea of being relegated to the home has meant both a devaluing of their care work in the ways outlined above, as well as a denigration of their professional art practices. In the 1980s, Rosika Parker and Griselda Pollock described the hierarchy of the arts as diverging from fine art to craft during the Renaissance. From this time onwards, there was an increasing amateurization of an art, thus relegated to craft status, embroidery. Parker and Pollock write that a crucial factor in this development was the growing separation between the public and private spheres, the home and the place of work. The external world of work became the sphere of men exclusively, and the internal work of the family and the household was the proper business of women, they write. Thus, the products of the proper business of women was ascribed lower value than the undertakings of men. The domestic as subject matter has also largely remained undervalued and under-acknowledged, and its productive potential overlooked. As my own multiple shifts and roles collided in lockdown mother space, my strategy to overcome the pressures of multitasking was to adopt the identity of the mother artist. Defining myself as a mother artist is a tactic that privileges my mother knowledge and creativity within my art practice. Journalist Alicia Allaire writes, "For the mother who is also an artist, or for the artist who is also a mother, compartmentalizing the experience of motherhood away from art is one option. The other is to integrate it into the work itself. While it would be wrong to think all these roles could be smoothly integrated, I reimagined this experience as fieldwork for my PhD research project. As studio painting again became an impossibility for me, as it had been when I was mothering babies and small children, I adopted instead more traditionally home-based and feminized domestic practices, such as sewing and needlework, bringing aspects of mothers' overlooked private experiences to attention. The resulting hand-sewn garments, incubator, and nursing underwear in turn bring the private spaces of the maternal body to public attention to challenge accepted norms of motherhood. Textile artist Emma Shin also recounts how she adapted her practice during extended lockdown periods, moving away from producing large-scale tapestries to instead make small, handheld embroidered forms that could easily be worked on for short periods within her living room studio. Adaptive responses to lockdown restrictions by mother artists show the potential for the home to be re-evaluated as a site for creative potential. Curator and art historian Lisa Slade suggests hopefully that our COVID experience will bring our domestic world, our intimate world, closer to the surface than it has ever been. Optimistically, she hopes this may lead to renewed power in the domestic, an idea that avoids the sentimentalization or idealization of the home and recognises the multiple pressures of work and care. COVID made clear the necessity to develop relational practices that embody an ethics of care, taking into account children and others, students, for example, in the suggestion of alternatives to neoliberal individualised motherhood. Similarly, in seeking to maintain connections with and between students in online teaching models, I hope to have extended an ethics of care into my teaching practice at this time and beyond. In this, I adopt a matricentric feminist approach led by compassion and ideas of hospitality. Rather than conforming to ideals of intensive mothering, of succeeding in all roles at once, this practice accepts adaptation and privileges well-being as an outcome. While I'm back at work in the classroom and the studio, it is perhaps misguided to believe we have moved easily into a post-COVID period, and we must be careful not to leave this pandemic period unexamined. Mothers who are also artists may be well placed to challenge the ideologies of neoliberal motherhood and the intensification of these under COVID conditions. Mother artists draw upon embodied experiences of mothering in opposition to the constructs of motherhood. Perhaps our teaching can similarly benefit from an examination of the potentials of creativity and relationality of the domestic sphere to counter the individualisation and isolation of students through online teaching and learning in the institution.
So we might have to leave it there, Zoe.
We're done. Thank you.